Hi everybody, my name's Liz Lestrange. I'm the head of department at the University of Birmingham, at the Department of Art History at the University of Birmingham, and it is my great delight to welcome everybody here for our second keynote lecture of this conference. Our keynote tonight is Eliza Garrison, who is Professor of Art History in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Middlebury College in Vermont in the States. And Eliza's research focuses on the art and art objects of the Carolingian and Ottonian Empires, including manuscripts and reliquaries, as well as on the historiography of medieval art, political representation, theories of portraiture, and simulative practices in the early Middle Ages. Her first book, Ottonian Imperial Art and Portraiture, The Artistic Patronage of Otto III and Henry II, appeared in 2012 with Ashgate and was reissued by Routledge in 2017. Her work has appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, and she's applied her interest in bodies, a theme which is part of today's paper, to more contemporary art too, curating the exhibition Naked Truth, Approaches to the Body in Early 20th Century German Austrian Art at Middlebury College Museum of Art in 2015. Eliza is currently working on a book on the Uta Codex, a multimedia artwork made in Regensburg in the 11th century for the use of Abbess Uta of Niedermünster and her community of nuns. This artwork is the topic of her talk today, which is entitled Space and Body in the Uta Codex. Before I hand over to her, I was going to say that we'll be taking questions at the end, as usual, as you might already know, via the chat function. But for now, Eliza, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you to the Association for Art History for inviting me. Thanks, of course, to Liz, Cheryl Platt, and Claire Davies for the organization. Everything seems to be running so well, and it's surely thanks to you and to all the other folks who are working on tech. I'd like to thank also the audience members who are slowly coming into the proverbial room. I see the numbers sort of go up in the corner of my screen. Thanks for taking the time to tune in. Like I said, it's really a distinct pleasure to be here. I'm going to keep my talk to a little over 40 minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions at the end. Okay, without further ado. At some point between 1020 and 1025, during the final years of Abbess Uta of Niedermünster's life, she or someone who admired her deeply donated to the treasury of the Niedermünster Canonry the object that we now know as the Uta Codex. It is one of the most sumptuous and complex artworks ever created by the monks at the Abbey of St. Emmeram in Regensburg, which was but a stone's throw from Niedermünster. By the end of the first quarter of the 11th century, St. Emmeram was one of the most influential sites of artistic production in the Ottonian Empire. The Codex actually comprises two elements, a massive golden book box and a relatively slim manuscript of select pericopes. Although these two components were made for each other, their mutual relationship has not been the focus of scholarly attention. In this talk, I will examine how both the case and the book simulate aspects of Christ's physical presence in their materiality and also in their visual evocation of a sacred interior space that is envisioned as continuous both with his body and with the space of the Niedermünster Abbey. In this scenario, the book and the case are extensions of one another. Both the symbolic order of the illuminations and the messages contained in the manuscript's seemingly countless inscriptions inscribed Uta into their strict geometric framework. They did so in the name of reform and in the interest of concerns over memoria and the practice of meditatio. I will also propose that the format of the illuminations likewise gave form to tensions over female monastics' access to the divine. Indeed, even as the book's glittering miniatures granted Uta unparalleled symbolic access to the word, this luxurious portal to the divine only allowed her to go so far. The large size of the two interdependent components of the Uta Codex makes clear that they were made to be used and displayed in the performance of the Mass at Niedermünster. The astonishing intricacy of the full-page illuminations, replete as they are with inscriptions that expound upon the theological truths envisioned therein, strongly suggests that the book's 6 illuminated double-page openings were also intended to be viewed contemplatively. 2 of these openings, at folios 1 verso and 2 recto, and 3 verso and 4 recto, can be considered a prefatory cycle to the text. In the first opening, which you see on the left, the hand of God faces a scene of Uta presenting a golden codex to Mary and child. The second opening, which you see on your right, reveals Saint Erhard's response to a symbolic crucifixion in the performance of the Mass. 4 additional openings, or excuse me, 4 additional openings with portraits of the evangelists facing large illuminated initials here and here divide the text of this book of pericopes. Ordinarily, books of pericopes, or evangelaries as they're also called, are organized according to the liturgical year, and yet the designers of the manuscript portion of the Uta Codex elected to group the pericopes according to the gospel texts from which they derive. One effect of this organization is that the manuscript contains or maintains the structural logic of a gospel book, even though it only contains a selection of excerpts. It is meaningful that the designers of this manuscript opted for this unusual organization. In doing so, they created a book that could reinforce the unity of the Gospels, as well as signify the manuscript's significance as an embodiment of Christ as Logos. My analysis today will consider the relationships between the cover and the first 2 illuminated openings of the manuscript, and yet all 6 of the illuminated openings in this book display a consistent emphasis on the tactility of the word, which is metaphorically aligned with Christ's body. Such emphases were established for the viewer before the book's golden case was opened. In considering the interplay between box and book, I will pay particular attention to the manner in which the book's illuminations are rendered as symbolic spaces for the figures that occupy them. Bruno Reudenbach has noted that the form of the codex, as opposed to the form of a scroll, allowed for scribes and illuminators to conceive of it as a sacred, or as a discrete space in which the room of the text and illuminations could suggest places for the reader, viewer's eye to linger. Reudenbach focuses chiefly on the architectonic forms used for canon tables, but his analysis nonetheless reminds us that the viewing communities of a work like the Uta Codex would have readily understood the space of the illuminated page as one possessed of depth. I further propose that the makers of the Uta Codex also constructed the miniatures to simulate from various angles the space of the Niedermünster Abbey as a material extension of Christ's own body. In doing so, the designers of these illuminations went to hitherto unexplored lengths to represent and construct the space of the word as a tangible architectonic structure. In advancing these propositions, I take an approach different from studies that have understandably privileged the rich inscriptions that seem to spill from every corner of the illuminations in the manuscript portion of the Uta Codex. I offer the present analysis as a way to track and explain the visual drama of the illuminations and the connections they share with the book box in the interest of making a case for the cohesiveness and programmatic nature of the Uta Codex as a liturgical object. In doing so, I will strike a balance between a logocentric interpretative mode and one that aims to comprehend divine forms which, ineffable as they are, can only be partially explained by their accompanying text. In Jeffrey Hamburger's now canonical study of devotional images made in the late 15th century by nuns at Eichstätt, images that are also replete with text, he noted that, quote, inscriptions elucidate drawings, but images do not rely on words alone for their meaning, end quote. Like the devotional imagery created at Bavarian convents centuries later, the Uta Codex as an object spoke not only through its words, but also through the divine forms hammered into its golden case and limned onto its parchment surfaces. The Uta Codex was created toward the end of Abbess Uta's life at a time when she could look back on over 3 decades of service to the Abbey of Niedermünster and its canonesses. The work's sumptuousness and its complexity make clear that no expense was spared in its creation. Indeed, its miniatures bear all of the vaunted stylistic traits of other books painted at St. Emmeram in Regensburg. However, with regard to the lavishness of its materials and the intricacy of its design, the Uta Codex outshines nearly all of the other extant manuscripts made in Regensburg in the 10th and 11th centuries. From the beginning of her tenure at Niedermünster around the year 990, Abbess Uta had been responsible for governing the reform of the abbey and thus encouraging her sisters to return to a strict observance of the Benedictine rule. As was the case throughout the Ottonian Empire, the canonesses of Niedermünster derived mostly from the ranks of the nobility, and they and their sisters at other abbeys and canonries enjoyed a level of education on par with that of their male monastic counterparts. The strictures of the rule aside, the lives of the Niedermünster canonesses appear to have involved a certain amount of communication with the monks at St. Emmeram, and of course, the Uta Codex itself testifies to this connection. Once the Uta Codex entered the treasury at Niedermünster, it would have been used on particularly important feast days for about 1/3 of the liturgical year. Considering the object's commanding scale and its remarkable opulence, it is clear that it was meant for display, and one has to imagine that the manuscript's removal from its case would have been an important part of the liturgical mise-en-scène on certain high feast days at Niedermünster. The clerics who were enlisted to perform liturgical services at the canonry would have had occasion to reflect upon the various meanings of the manuscript's illuminations in the course of the book's use. It is also likely that Uta and other members of the community at Niedermünster would have viewed the book's illuminations as a part of their personal devotion, for these were designed to be scrutinized with the utmost care and reflection. A large enthroned Christ in majesty dominates the golden case of the Uta Codex, and his figure sets much of the tone for the rest of the object, in which Christ's incarnation and the world of the new law can be visually and spiritually apprehended. Christ's seated figure is elongated, it's almost oval, and each of his hands is pressed firmly against his body. Nimbed and swathed in pleated gold sheeting, Christ raises his right hand in benediction and clutches a codex to his body with his left. This jeweled book is emblazoned with the Alpha and the Omega. The hand that blesses is strikingly large and long. Its size is roughly equivalent to the jeweled codex Christ holds in his other hand. David Ganz has observed that the codex that Christ grips is coterminous with his body. This detail establishes a clear equivalency between body and book. This most sacred of bodies is also marked by the decisive physicality of Christ's figure, which at 40 centimeters takes up nearly the entire height of the case, and it is carved in such high relief that its depth is nearly equivalent to the upper section of the case that supports it. Most immediately, the front of the case of the Uta Codex evokes book covers that make up the binding of the book to which they are attached. Unlike a book, however, the case of the Uta Codex opens on the left. This means that the case is functionally a box, and thus morphologically it shares much in common with other contemporary liturgical objects such as reliquaries. So while it is in direct conversation with the formal aspects of a work like the cover of the Codex Aureus of St. Emmeram, which dates to about 870, we can also think of it as a functional cousin of sorts to an object like the reliquary of St. Andrew in Trier, which predates the Uta Codex by over 40 years. The rich and meaningful relationship between the case and the manuscript connects them to Irish book shrines like the 11th century shrine of St. Molez. Even the interior of the case of the Uta Codex bears out comparisons to reliquaries and book shrines. The box was once lined with precious textiles, most likely silk from the Near East, so as to luxuriously envelop its contents. Those with access to the Uta Codex were among the precious few who would have caught a glimpse of the chromatic interplay between the textiles when the manuscript was removed from and placed back into the box. Today, the manuscript component of the Uta Codex is bound in a suede cover from 1962. This replaced an earlier 18th century binding. Traces of bookworms on the manuscript's first and last folios indicate that the book was contained in a binding that would have been susceptible to damage from insects and worms. Recent work on the Uta Codex has thus proposed that this could mean that one of the earlier bindings was one of wood boards covered with textiles. Given the material splendor of the case and keeping in mind the coordination between case and book, a textile binding for the Codex that was itself contained in a golden box lined with textiles would have been a logical choice from a practical and aesthetic standpoint. Since the canonesses at Niedermünster also created textiles for liturgical use, we might even imagine that some of their own work came to form part of the Codex. Like the artworks to which it's morphologically related, the case of the Uta Codex, with its monumental representation of Christ in majesty, was made to function as a type of reliquary container for the relic/book, understood here as the body of Christ as Logos. The makers of both components of the Uta Codex understood it as an embodied object. The manuscript portion in particular was made to emphasize its significance as both word and flesh. Conceiving of the manuscript component of the Uta Codex as a relic of Christ as Logos may help explain the staggering number of inscriptions that weave in, out, and through the illuminations. They each speak in different ways to Christ's majesty, much in the manner of an authentic, the label or tag that medieval people often attach to relics as a way to authenticate them and establish their physical source. In the performance of the Mass at Niedermünster, the Uta Codex's journey from the sacristy to the altar would have been likened to Christ's own entry into the world, and the removal of the book from its case would have been staged as a moment of revelation. Here, the textiles inside the case and those presumably on the book's original cover would have asserted the revelatory drama that was so important to the design of both components of this artwork. If the pronounced physicality of the figure of Christ in majesty on the box's front and the manner in which he holds his codex signaled an equivalency between body and book, the case's clear similarity to a reliquary underscored the significance of the manuscript portion of the Uta Codex as an embodiment of Christ. Thus, on the box, we see the shimmering majesty of Christ's exterior form, while the contents of the book manifest in word and paint the manner in which Christ's glory and the glory of his physical body was imagined in the first quarter of the 11th century. Inside the Uta Codex, it becomes even more apparent that the gold of the case set the tone for the cycle of illuminations, for the miniatures are suffused with gold in a manner that is unmatched in other Ottonian manuscripts. The forceful relationships between book and body established on the box are expanded and elaborated in the golden frameworks for the figures, forms, and inscriptions that fill the illuminations. Close analysis of the illuminations in the first two openings reveals that their creators envisioned them as interlocking heavenly spaces and as visualizations of the interior of a sacred body. These spaces are further aligned with the space of the cloister and with that of the Abbey Church of Niedermünster. The golden aesthetic of the Uta Codex, as it is heralded on the case, extends throughout the text of the book. It is announced in an especially dynamic fashion across the folios of these two openings. In the virtual world of the manuscript, the illumination's golden spaces honor the sacredness of Christ as an embodiment of the Word. If the golden case focuses on Christ's eternal and apocalyptic presence through both its materiality and iconography, the shimmering first opening of the manuscript presents a series of two interdependent, non-narrative scenes that immediately reveal their significance as visual and material extensions of the body of Christ on the box. Facing illuminations like the pair immediately following them in the next opening are dynamic and animated by a kinetic force. The various figures and forms on the page seem to be responding to the same sensory cues. This impression is heightened all the more by the nearly identical format of the facing pages. Together, these two illuminations appear to offer a glimpse into a heavenly space wrought of gold and embellished with sumptuous textiles and enamels. These illuminated spaces are entirely in keeping with the dazzling visuality of the case. The visual realms of this opening and those that follow are imagined as phenomenological renderings of Christ's own body as a precious space, which the viewer was invited to contemplate and move through in her mind's eye. In imagining how one might simulate the inner reaches of such a body, the illuminators drew from an aesthetics of reliquary and book cover design, and this would have been especially easy to do at St. Emmeram, since in the first quarter of the 11th century, the goldsmith workshop there was among the leading European centers of this art. In designing the manuscript component of the Uta Codex, that is, its makers imagined a reliquary turned outside in. Since Christ left behind no physical remains, the word contained in the four Gospels excerpted in the Codex functions as a relic, which the case enshrines. On folio 1 verso, a golden right hand of God rises up from the lower part of the central medallion, held up by two crowned female figures whose identity is unclear. The large golden initials that wrap around the inside of this roundel remind the reader-viewer, quote, God, encompassing all time by his everlasting will, has from eternity hallowed all things which he created by his word, end quote. This deeply symbolic image surely would have prompted 11th century viewers to reflect on the eternal nature of the divine, and the combination of triangular and circular forms on this and the facing folio would have called to mind the forms to which the word gave shape, perhaps the most important of which was Christ's own body. Viewers of this image would certainly have also recognized the parallels between this golden right hand and the golden hand of God that reaches upward on one of the gables on the 9th century Arnulf Ciborium, which was among the many treasures kept at St. Emmeram, and which the illuminators portrayed in full in the following opening. On folio 1 verso, the sculptural model has been cleverly deconstructed. The triangular gable appears as an actual triangle, and as on the Ciborium, the hand reaches upward from a semicircular cloud-like mass. Even such small points of continuity are significant, for it makes clear that the Uta Codex, both box and book, were deliberately conceived as functional and conceptual extensions of the Arnulf Ciborium. Facing this page on folio 2 recto, Abbess Uta offers her codex to an enthroned Marian child. The abbess is depicted as if her body were encased inside this virtual world, like a pressed flower, if you will, for her figure is superimposed over the space of the illumination. Wearing a blue and white veil and a simple brown dress, Uta is the only figure in this opening depicted without gold adornments, save for the codex she offers to the Virgin and Child and holds away from her body. On both pages of this opening, female figures, including the cardinal virtues and the four corners of the Hand of God page, observe the encounter between God's hand and Mary and Child and respond in kind. Inside the central medallion on folio 2 recto, Mary and Child react to God's presence. Mary, crowned and veiled, looks toward the hand on the facing page and raises her own right hand in a gesture of mimetic response and approbation. The Christ child nestled in Mary's lap echoes the figure of Christ on the cover of the Uta Codex. Clad in a gold mantle worn over a blue tunic, the child's posture and gesture reproduce exactly those of the monumental Christ in Majesty on the case, right down to the golden codex he clutches at his side. As on the cover, Christ's golden codex on this folio is rendered as if it were part of his body, an effect the artist accomplished by matching the gold of the book to the gold of his mantle. Is this codex he grips the book of life? Is it a depiction showing Christ already holding the codex that Uta offers up to him below? Or can one understand it as a reference to both texts? The answers to these questions were likely left open to accommodate numerous possibilities. If nothing else, one key truth visualized here is that of the incarnation, so that this figure of Christ enthroned could be read as a pendant to and an extension of the monumental vision of Christ in Majesty on the case. This painted throne of wisdom presents the reader-viewer with a series of equivalencies that hinge on the web of theological ideas that connected Mary's flesh with Christ's and Christ's flesh with the Word, and furthermore, with the flesh of the parchment page and with the flesh of Christ's earthly body. Both in the act of viewing the golden book box and in the act of opening the book, the reader-viewer became a symbolic witness to the incarnation, which she could also touch as she contemplated the meanings and allusions of the book's numerous inscriptions. In closing the book, the reader-viewer played a role in symbolically sealing this Holy Family inside its own celestial sphere, in which Father, Mother, and Child are united in shared gestures of blessing. In this scenario, the heavenly embellishments surrounding the hand of God can be understood as the dome of heaven, while the city-like enclosure that frames Mary and Child suggests the heavenly city. The spaces of these two roundels thus constitute heaven itself. The first opening presents the reader-viewer with a vision of Uta ensconced inside a space that speaks to the interiority of spiritual vision. It may not be coincidental that this intimate space is peopled by chiefly female figures who are ordered and contained by architectonic enclosures. The strict organization of the illuminations here makes manifest a spiritual space that is subject to a rigorous and sacred order. The visual suggestion that this illuminated realm is one of closeness and interiority anticipates trends in late medieval devotional imagery, particularly scenes that encourage the viewer to envision themselves inside Christ's body. Further, the repeated visual emphasis on manual gestures may have also recalled for Uta the gestures she and her sisters at Niedermünster would have used to communicate with one another in the interest of maintaining their vows of silence. In the move from the coterminous heavenly spaces invoked in the first opening to the second illuminated opening, which you see on the screen, the viewer's gaze processes to two interconnected scenes situated in a carefully rendered yet abstract church interior. The matching frameworks of the first opening give way to two interdependent illuminations whose basic geometric order relates to the first miniatures. However, the seemingly heterogeneous structures of the miniatures in the second opening respond to each other formally, even though at first glance that may not appear to be the case. These formal responses are grounded in various repeated textual and visual emphases on the significance of Christ's body as the body of the church, ecclesia, and on St. Erhard's own body as an integral part of the space of the Abbey Church of Niedermünster. In this shift from the first opening to the second, in which a symbolic crucifixion on the left is matched with the mystical Mass of St. Erhard on the right, the viewer is presented with a visionary space that was cloaked with references to her environment. Indeed, the events in these two scenes take place inside the Abbey Church of Niedermünster, and yet the centrality of Erhard's figure on the right makes reference to tales of his beneficent presence at the high altar of the church, as two mid-11th century relate. It is perhaps the suggestion of a kind of narrativity in these scenes that has led other scholars to characterize this space as somehow connected to the material world. Surely, the repeated presence of Abbess Uta's figure is what might root this image most easily in the 11th century present. On folio 4 recto, on the right, she has moved from the center to the periphery, where she views the mystical Mass from her own gallery on the upper right. She's up there in the upper right-hand corner, in that upper right-hand box. Her movement inside the symbolic spaces of the manuscript also represents and evokes a procession from the cloister as a space of meditation and spiritual communion to the Abbey Church of Niedermünster, where Uta and her sisters could witness the celebration of the Mass. Both types of communion with the divine were understood as visionary experiences of some sort. The scenes on these folios are expansive and they're filled with action. Visual cues make clear that the viewer is presented here with an idealized church interior in which the contents of the Niedermünster treasury have come alive. Both pages either allude to or explicitly reproduce actual liturgical artworks. As in the first opening, the figures in these scenes are coordinated by their gestures and surrounded by golden architectonic scaffolding. But while the first illuminated opening can be understood to show a shared space of Uta's intimate communion with Christ, Mary, and God, the second opening reveals two connected liturgical spaces in which Uta's figure, which now dons a golden veil and identifies her as Domina Abbatissa. I'm going to try to point to it, but I don't know if you'll see it, but it's right here. Hopefully that worked. Her figure has been moved from the center to the margins where she views and responds to the scene below. The appearance of first Mary and then Erhard, the patron saints of Niedermünster, in close succession was a clever device to present a visual inventory of the Abbey Church's treasures. Like Christ's vividly living crucified body on folio 3 verso, Erhard's depiction on folio 4 recto also shows him in a transcendent form. He died around 715 after succeeding Emmeram as Bishop of Regensburg, and his body lay interred at Niedermünster. Although the inscription that appears to rest above his shoulders and behind his body identifies him as Saint Herardus, I'm talking about this right here, he was not canonized until 1052. In the scene on folio 4 recto, the viewer sees him and a deacon celebrating the Mass as they face and respond to the symbolic crucifixion. In keeping with her position as a privileged spectator, Uta faces a female personification of the Benedictine ideal of love of piety alone, which is placed in the upper left-hand corner of the image, 2 further female personifications of the ideals of temperament, of discretion, and firmness and strictness are placed in the lower left and right corners of the miniature, respectively. Whereas the mirrored spaces in the first opening signaled in part that they were coterminous, the illuminators used different devices here to suggest coextensive spaces. Each miniature shares a similar underlying structure, which is expanded and loosened to make space for the dramatic confrontation between the 2 scenes. And the organization of these 2 images thus combines points of view. The symbolic crucifixion allows us to view this event from Erhard's perspective, while the mystical mass appears from the standpoint of a viewer in the nave looking toward the high altar. These staged points of view enjoin the reader-viewer to reflect on the coordinated acts of witnessing and vision that unfold on both pages. Indeed, the figures of Uta, Erhard, and the deacon react to messages and forms contained in the symbolic crucifixion. The crucified Christ is priestly and alert. Nimbed, crowned, and clad in a stola and a rich purple garment that resembles something called a colobium, he gazes down to his right. His golden cross is placed in front of the upper of 2 vertically stacked mandorlas and propped up behind the lower edge of the bottom mandorla. If the upper mandorla is embellished with a semicircular form at its apex, the addition of that very same shape at the bottom of the lower mandorla appears as an extension of Christ's cross. This visual device makes it appear as if the cross were steadied by the frame of the lower mandorla. Here, the illuminator rendered the cross as a liturgical object brought to life in the celebration of the Mass. And yet the cross here is also suggestive of the historical cross, for the small mound of earth that we see suggested here at the foot evokes Golgotha. Unlike contemporary liturgical crosses, in which Christ's figure is often shown at the moment of his death, and on the right you see the gorgeous Lothar cross, which is a liturgical cross, and then the monumental crucifix in Cologne. Unlike these examples, the crucified Christ in the Uta Codex appears not to suffer in the least, and that dynamic force animates and guides the gazes of the personifications of Ecclesia, here in this semicircular roundel at the left edge of the miniature, and Vita, who stands at the foot of the cross and cranes her neck to meet Christ's downward gaze. Vita's reaction to Christ begins a visual chain of mimetic responses to the crucifixion that resound throughout this opening. She raises her hands in an orant gesture that Erhard, the deacon, and Abbess Uta mimic on the facing folio. The personification of death, labeled here as Mors, and a figure of synagoga here, which are both positioned to Christ's left, are cast into postures of weakness and submission, and their gazes are accordingly turned away from Christ. Much in the same way that the symbolic crucifixion presents us with slippages between real and represented, the Mass of St. Erhard envisions the Niedermünster treasury come alive, as if the cross on the facing folio had renewed and revivified the long-dead Erhard. Indeed, the illuminations paired in this opening are a forceful visual testament to the power that liturgical objects had for 11th century Christians. Like Vita on the facing page, Erhard is an alert and devout orant and a type for Christ. In order to enhance the connection between these two figures as embodiments of the Corpus Ecclesiae, the designers of this opening positioned Erhard's head at Christ's feet, meaning that the interaction between them would have been activated in the opening and closing of the book. Erhard appears here too as a model bishop and celebrant. On Erhard's right and on our left, we see an altar draped with a textile of apparent Near Eastern origin here, like those that had lined the interior of the case, of course. And the altar is also topped with the golden liturgical objects necessary for the performance of the Mass. The ciborium here that takes up so much space in this section of the miniature is none other than the Arnulf ciborium itself, which was housed at the Abbey of St. Emmeram and used by the monks there as a traveling altar. Since the Codex Aureus of St. Emmeram was among the most precious works in the Abbey's treasury, indeed it was among the most precious works in the empire, scholarship on the Uta Codex has tended to assume that the golden codex propped against the miniature's left border, this book right here, depicts this Carolingian gospel book. Considering the appearance of Uta's own codex in the previous opening, I think that we can just as easily understand that we are seeing the Uta Codex here among other treasury objects. To be sure, an artwork as complex as the Uta Codex could allow for a certain amount of deliberate ambiguity, for it is clear that its exquisite materials and the striking sophistication of its design were open responses to the overall preciousness and beauty of the Codex Aureus of St. Emmeram. Whether or not we are seeing a portrait of the Codex Aureus next to the Arnulf ciborium on folio 4 recto of the Uta Codex, the Carolingian manuscript's majestic 2-page dedication scene was famously a formal point of departure for the scene of St. Erhard celebrating the Mass. If in the Carolingian scene the illuminator rendered the throne loge and cupola of the palace chapel of Aachen, the illuminators of the Uta Codex used the earlier model to simulate the interior space of the Niedermünster Church in use by the Abbey's episcopal patron saint. Adam Cohen's recent work on this second opening has proposed that the language of the inscriptions in the opening, and specifically on the page that you see on the screen, reinforced ideals of monastic behavior. This argument draws attention to the appearance of 3 books on the page of the mystical Mass, here with the Lamb, here on the altar, and here in the lower right corner of the miniature. And Cohen's argument relates the appearance of these 3 books to reform efforts at Niedermünster, noting that the book as a symbol came to stand for reform. And I would add that the visual repetition of books here, or really the book, emphasizes their metaphorical correlation to Christ's body and to the body of the church. At the top of the folio, a partial roundel containing the Lamb of God, astride an open golden codex, rests above the canopy of the altar. The inscription that physically links the Lamb of God to the figure of Uta derives from the text uttered before the communion, quote, "Lamb of God, you who take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us." And that is right here. The text inscribed on the golden codex, upon which the Lamb of God rests, asks the viewer to, quote, "Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart." Such an emphasis on Christ's body and its presence in the Eucharist appears again in the now faded red vault above the altar. And here you can see this space is what I'm talking about, and it's absolutely filled with text. Here Christ is praised in one of the golden texts here as the true bread. And in this part of the inscription, we see reference to how Christ, quote unquote, nourishes the church with his body. The intersection of body and church, here both the church writ large and the Abbey Church of Niedermünster, appears once again in the diagrammatic inscriptions in the golden roundels of Erhard's Rational. These divide his figure. The scholarship on this scene has shown that the set of inscriptions that we see derive from Eriogena's translation of commentary on the Pseudo-Dionysius's celestial hierarchy. In the lowest roundel, we see the shadow of the law, which is surmounted by the body of the church at the center of Erhard's figure. The uppermost roundel, which is placed over his heart, speaks to the light of eternal life. In featuring this hierarchy on top of Erhard's saintly episcopal body and along the middle axis of the illumination, an axis it shares with the body of the Lamb and its glorious codex, the designers of this page represented the space of the Abbey Church of Niedermünster as a kind of heavenly body. These inscriptions also map Erhard's body onto the space of the church. Likewise, the hierarchy of the texts in the roundels bespeaks a move from the earthly to the celestial. Like Christ, Erhard's body is also a corpus ecclesiae. Here, in the final scene of the sequence prefacing the pericopes, the manuscripts makers emphasized anew the spaces, objects, and figures in which Christ's presence was enlivened and made manifest. Erhard's role in the scene is manifold. He is an embodiment of Old Testament priestly ideals. He is a type for Christ and the church, and he is a model celebrant for the male clerics who would use this book in the performance of the Mass, not least for the female monastic viewers who might have used this text for the purposes of personal devotion. Erhard's figure could serve as a visual proxy for the celebrant. So to conclude, suffused with artistic and intellectual ambition, the Uta Codex's components enjoined its users in various ways to reflect on Christ's incarnation and the ways in which his presence was revealed in the celebration of the Mass and in the personal devotions of Uta and her sisters. Indeed, his very body could be imagined to form the foundations of the physical spaces they occupied in their day-to-day lives. On the case, and in the two monumental double-page openings to the manuscript, the reader-viewer was called to ruminate on the significance of the codex as a substitute for Christ's body, and thus as a kind of relic. The extraordinarily opulent spaces of these miniatures were structured with texts that derived from every form of learning that Abbess Uta and her sisters cherished. They could not only reflect on the various meanings of the texts that order and decorate the miniatures, but they were invited to join these spaces with their bodies and eyes, anticipating devotional trends that would be verbalized by theologians in the 12th century and visualized by artists with increasing intensity in the 15th. In these openings, it is Abbess Uta who experiences both direct and mediated connections to the divine. We see her as visionary and witness to the incarnation and crucifixion in a book that was intended to honor her legacy at Niedermünster, just as it offered space for contemplation and devotion. At this point of closure and reflection, I would like to remind the reader, or actually all of you out there in the audience, that this terrifically sophisticated 11th century Gesamtkunstwerk testifies to a desire to put female monastics in contact with liturgical processes from which they were excluded. Indeed, the movement of Uta's figure from the center to a privileged spot on the periphery pictures this phenomenon. As the viewer gets closer to the text of the pericopes, Uta's figure moves from a direct encounter with the Holy Family to one mediated by a male religious authority. It is essential to the understanding of this artwork that Uta's movement to the margins in a book made in her honor is a treatment and a device that her male peers would not need to employ. Nonetheless, in their use of the Uta Codex as a sumptuous devotional tool, Uta and the rest of the book's female users could envision themselves and their abbess as united with the living force of the word itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliza. I'm just trying to get myself back onto the screen. That was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just trying to, yes, grappling with the technology. Yes, I for one have now learned that the Uta Codex is not one thing, it's two things. It's a box and a manuscript. It's amazing. We've got time for questions. If you want to ask a question, you have to click the Live Now button, apparently, and then scroll down to beneath the blurb about Eliza's talk, and there's a questions button, and you can put things in there. We already have 2 questions there.
Lovely.
Can you see them, Eliza?
I can't, but I'll refresh and I'll do exactly what you told everyone else to do.
Yeah. So you need to.
Right. Oh, hello.
Yes.
Should we?
Should I read it out and answer? So
yeah.
That's Beth Williamson at Bristol. I'm just going to skip through to the question. Do you have anything more to say about the way in which users could imagine the hand of God and a hand of the Virgin on this opening, touching one another as the folios came together when the book is closed, with this closing action also closing and embracing Uta between the 2 folios, and thus also within Christ's symbolic body, as you showed? Yeah. What an amazing question.
Yeah, I mean, yes, Beth, indeed. I have thought about it, and I think that's exactly what's going on. Absolutely. I don't really have anything more to say about it at the moment, except for the fact that when I first began this project, what initially drew me to that opening was in fact the manual gestures. And I was thinking initially that when I embarked on this project, that I was going to talk a lot more about touching and things like that, but I do think that it relates to some of the other ideas that I kind of bring up at the end of the talk, where it's in that space where we see Uta especially, but maybe Uta as a kind of proxy for other women at the canonry, being able to actually touch, aspects of the divine that are sort of visualized or pictured in that opening. So yeah, and I assume once I finally have time to work on the book, once school's over, I'll definitely be picking that up a little bit more, and I'd love to talk to you about it. I'm sure you have lots of knowledge that you can just dump on me about that.
You think the book was actually ever kissed? Do you think is there any sort of evidence it might have been?
It doesn't look like there's any. I mean, when I get a chance to look at it in person, I'll be able to check, but there's not, there are signs of use, but those are on the corners of the pages. So it doesn't look like, as far as I can tell from the amount of scrutiny I've been able to do with, high resolution PDFs and things like that, it doesn't appear to have been the case. And I think it was really only used on very special occasions. And I think that when I'm talking about it being used as a sort of devotional object, I think it was used as a devotional object by very few people and in very sort of limited circumstances. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another question from Hilary McCartney at Glasgow, who wants to know, do any fragments of the textiles made at the nunnery survive?
Yes. They do, and in fact, they survive in Bamberg at the cathedral treasury there. And one of the most famous examples of their needlework is, of course, Henry II's star cloak. Yeah, so that'll be a really interesting piece to figure out if I can, once I embark on the sort of larger or I'm able to expand the larger project. But I have a feeling, maybe, I don't know you, but I have a feeling you're maybe asking that question because it is really kind of fascinating to think about the ways in which their own work could have been integrated into the kind of material, into the actual physical object. But maybe we can also think about the ways in which their own work as textile artists came to inform the sort of textile-like qualities of the miniatures in the Uta Codex, because even the painted aspects of the miniatures really do evoke the look of precious textiles and liturgical textiles, and that's something that going I'm really excited to work on.
Mm.
Yeah.
But do any more objects from the treasury survive as well, or there or any other?
From the Abbey.
No.
No. No. No.
Just the Chiborium.
No knowledge dumping, says Beth. Yeah.
And there's another question from Heather at Edinburgh. The book box, have you looked at how it stayed closed when closed? Is there a latch, some sort of closing mechanism? Are there any other attachments on the outside?
Yeah, I wish I could have brought in some shots of the other side. But those, if you're interested, those are in fact available on the website for the Bavarian State Library. So if you were to search for Uta Codex book box, you would be brought to a sort of page where there are hundreds of reproductions of the exterior. But yes, it was latched, and I do think, although I can't really prove it right now, but I do think that the box was constructed so that it could be propped up. And another scholar who's worked on this, someone named Uta Codex, has she suggested in a footnote in one of her pieces of scholarship on the Uta Codex that this could have possibly been the case. We can imagine the case as almost like another piece of liturgical furniture, right? That would have also been visible during the celebration of the Mass.
Is it a one-off survival? Are there any other of these boxes?
There are other bookcases, but none that are as extraordinary as this one. So there are examples, or we suspect that there are examples of extraordinarily luxurious treasure bindings that actually began their lives as book boxes. So, for example, the beautiful cover of the Book of Pericopes that Emperor, or back then King Henry II, donated to Bamberg in 1012, that may have been a book box of a similar type. I'm not so sure myself, but that has been suggested. He also is associated with another object that is that's kept at a collection in Munich that was kind of refurbished in the later Middle Ages as a kind of reliquary, and that could have actually been a book box originally. So I know of examples from the Ottonian period, and I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who might be able to think of other examples from either later or earlier periods. That's actually why I kind of got on the sort of trail of the Irish book shrine, because those seem to me to be really the closest models for something like the Uta Codex, which is of course much larger, but still. Yeah.
Just think there's any more. I realize
I know.
Questions go from the bottom up, so I'm sorry for Hilary for asking best questions.
I know. I'm going to.
I was trying to scroll down and it doesn't scroll down. Yeah. One of the question I had was, when you say a bit more about Uta, I mean, do you think she was actually behind the commissioning? I mean, she's very sort of she's in there, isn't she? She's up there and
she
kind of,
is. Yeah. And Adam Cohen. Yeah, and Adam Cohen, of course, who literally wrote the book on the Uta Codex. He has this, which is going to be extraordinarily helpful to me as I embark on the rest of this project. But he suggests that she, in fact, may have had a hand in the design of a lot of the miniatures, and one can imagine too of the case. Because the inscriptions in the work seem, first of all, there are so many of them, and so many of them seem to be personalized to a specific kind of taste and to a specific kind of audience. And that would suggest that that she, since she seems to have had a hand in its design, that she could have had a hand in its, the process of commissioning the object, but we honestly have no proof. And so that's why, at the beginning of the talk, I tried to frame it as openly as I possibly could, because one could also imagine that that we can think of it as a kind of like communal commission on the part of the the women at the Abbey, wanting to mark a particularly important celebration in her life. There have been also suggestions that it was commissioned after she died and was, could have been a memorial, had a memorial function in that way. And that's, sort of the more I look at this, the more, maybe not likely, but the more interesting that theory appears. Yeah, so it's totally
possibilities, isn't it? It doesn't really matter if she commissioned it or not, but if you, as you suggest, she was there. It was being used not just in the mass, but also as a devotional object by these nuns in a sort of community. That's in itself is interesting. I mean, but what struck me was she's sort of encroaching on the mass, isn't she? She can't celebrate it as a woman. She can't, actually, perform the mass, but she's kind of there. As they're doing it, there's no way you can sort of ignore her presence. So that kind of approaching on masculine space and the way that she's doing that on the page, and she's doing it within the mass itself. So it was really quite fascinating.
It's really interesting too, and you see too that her veil moves from being sort of plain, right, to being golden in that little space too. Yeah, I don't know.
Isn't the Lamb of God looking at her? It's a kind of,
yes, he is. Oh, it's very, yeah, he's kind of turning back like, hey girl, yeah, yeah, I see you.
Yeah, that's very, I mean, like you said, she's in there, she's in the margins, isn't she? But she's also in that kind of privileged, kind of visual communication with the Lamb of God. So yeah,
she's in visual communication. She's actually she's in visual communication with the Lamb of God, and even if we think of the text as is embodied in some way, it's also a sort of physical connection that's suggested there too. Yeah, thank you.
Haven't any more questions? We are pretty much on time. Is there anyone else in the audience who wants to dive in with the last question?
We did have the idea that people might want to submit recipes for Uta Codex themed cocktails.
That's true, we did.
Yeah.
Anyone got any suggestions? Something that gets all that glittering, shimmering gold going in the bar. Yeah. Right. There did seem to be some sort of roundels that look rather like kind of umbrellas, which could be construed as, cocktail accessories. But
I'm sure they'd approve. I'm sure they'd definitely approve.
Nuns would approve, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they'll come flying into you on your email address.
Yeah, I would say folks don't have questions now. Please feel free to write me an email. Also, if there's something that I got horribly wrong in my talk, please email me and let me know. But yeah, it's been lovely.
Great to listen to you. Thank you so much for.
Thank you.
The benefits of online, I suppose, is that you get to do this without having jet lag.
Exactly, completely. The sad is that we don't get to go out afterwards. But
next time we will do the cocktail mixing in person. So
exactly.
I think it just remains for me to say thank you to everyone who's come and listened today, and I hope you're all genuinely enjoying the conference. We're sorry we're not actually in Birmingham, of course, but we hope that you're still making the most of everything. Thank you again to Eliza. We look forward to the book coming out.
Thank you.
And yeah, good luck with that. And thanks everybody. So
thanks everyone.
Applause for everyone. So.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.